Hey everybody, happy Friday. I guess it doesn't mean that much right now. Friday, Monday, Wednesday, they're all kind of running together. But we thought we'd get you out in the woods again today. And what I wanted to talk about today was something that people ask me a lot about when they're on campus. They ask about these pine plantations, these white pine plantations that we have on campus. So I thought today Pete and I would take a walk through one of the plantations. I'd talk a little bit about why they're here, what they're good for, and how we manage them. So a little different than natural history. This one's going to be a little more focused on some management. So hopefully that'll interest you all. Before we start though, I want to point out a couple species that I've mentioned, or at least one that I've mentioned that I wasn't able to show you in another species. I want to point out Virginia creeper. This is Virginia creeper right here. It's got these 5 leaflets here. A lot of people mistake it for poison ivy. This is poison ivy with the 3, right? So if you hold them up, poison ivy here, Virginia creeper to the left. Now, I know a lot of you are like, I thought that guy knew what he was doing. He's holding poison ivy. I don't get poison ivy. The heat doesn't bother me. Bugs leave me alone. I don't get poison ivy. So I'm built to be a forester in the South. So this is Virginia creeper. And remember one of our earlier wanders, I told you that vines hold on in a few different ways. They can have tendrils like grapes. They can entwine like bittersweet. They can have aerial roots like poison ivy that actually go in. But these have holdfasts and they come right off, and you won't be able to see them in here, but next time you see Virginia creeper, pull some off, and you'll notice these little hairs that look like they have tree frog suction cups on them. And that's how they hold on to the tree. So that's Virginia creeper, and Virginia creeper is in the grape family. It's a beautiful vining species if you have rock walls or sides of houses that you want to put it on. Here's another one that I just wanted to point out to show you. This is an invasive species. This is barberry, Japanese barberry. And I wanted to show you this one for kind of a cool reason. Hopefully you can see there. See how when you scrape the bark, how yellow it is underneath the bark? The cambium is bright yellow. That's because Japanese barberry has hydrostein and berberine, some of the same chemicals that you'll find in golden seal and yellow root. It's microbial properties that give off a yellow color in the cambium. So that's Japanese barberry. It has these small leaves, and you can't see them, but there's prickles all up and down the stems. So there's a couple species I wanted to point out before we head out into the plantation. All right, I can't resist. Here's one other great species before we talk about white pine. This is mulberry right here. This is red mulberry, our native mulberry. It's got these heart-shaped leaves, right? It's got these heart-shaped leaves. It can start off as looking kind of shrubby, but it can become a large single-stem tree, and it usually does. You're going to mistake this for basswood, for tilia, for basswood. Basswood, typically the buds are much different, but on the basswood, the leaf bases aren't as symmetrical, and they're very asymmetrical. If you ever looked at this leaf base, and instead of being nice and symmetrical here, if it was ever looking like this, asymmetrical, that is more common in basswood. Mulberry is a great species to have. It's a great wildlife species, a summer wildlife species. So it has the purple berries on it. Birds, mammals love mulberry. You know, one of my favorite things about mulberries is if you have little kids and you have a mulberry tree in your yard. My son, when I lived in Connecticut, used to hang out underneath the mulberry tree, and he would come in with purple feet, purple hands, and a purple face from eating them. You never want to park your white Volvo underneath a mature mulberry tree because it'll be covered with purple dye. So this is mulberry, great wildlife food, common. This is our red mulberry. It's not the paper mulberry, which is not a native species in this area. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this white pine stand, and here's a good example here. So we've talked a lot about white pine. People ask about these pure white pine stands. If Pete kind of pans, you'll notice there's really nothing growing out here in the overstory except for white pine And the other thing you'll notice about them is that they're really evenly spaced, not only between rows, but between trees within rows. And that's really typical for planting white pine. So again, white pine is an important timber tree. And these trees here are actually about 32 years old, now actually about 34 years old. And one of the cool things with white pine is they put on a whorl of branches every year. You can see these whorls of branches. So when you look at white pine, you can count the whorls and get the age of the tree. It could be a little sketchy. Sometimes when they're older, it's hard to find the bottom ones and they get really tight when they get up to the top. But generally speaking, you can get a pretty good age on white pine by counting the rings, whorls of branches that come up. That's not the case for Virginia pine, for shortleaf pine, or for pitch pine, which also grow in this area. So here's a quiz for you. I'm a professor. Gotta ask you questions. What vine is this? We learned this on the river trail. What vine is this with this shreddy, reddish bark? This is grapevine. This is grapevine here. So let's get back to white pine. Sorry, I got distracted. So white pine is often grown in this plantation setting. Now, one thing to think, you know, plantations, some people actually love the look of this plantation. It doesn't do much for me. I prefer a multi-layered mixed forest much more than these plantations. But some people really like these plantations, you know, and some people really dislike plantations. They see them as artificial. They prefer naturally regenerated forests much more. You know, and there's, like everything else in life, there's give or take. Plantations, pine plantations like this, they're not great for biodiversity, okay? Especially when they're closed. Everything you see growing on the floor here is mostly viney species, weedy species, but there's not a lot of native biodiversity underneath these pine plantations. So if you're really interested in high biodiversity forests, plantations aren't for you. The other side of that, though, is we have to balance it with the fact that you can grow a lot of timber in a plantation. That's the upside of plantations. So, you know, it's a give and take management system in that, sure, there's less biodiversity in a plantation, but if you can grow plantations in the appropriate places, and I'm saying in the appropriate places, I want to be careful here. If you do grow some plantations, you can grow far more wood on a smaller area, which means you don't have to be harvesting wood from naturally regenerated forests. So it's a little bit of a give and take. There's a fun exercise that was done and presented to the United Nations. Oh boy, now it was probably in the 90s. And this forester fella from Europe proposed that if we turned the country of Belgium into a tree plantation, we could supply all the wood for the world without having to cut any more natural forests. I don't know what the people in Belgium would think about that, but that's this idea that if you had a small area of intensely managed timber, you wouldn't have to be managing natural forests. So one of the things we do when we're managing white pine plantations is we plant the trees at a much higher density than we're looking for at the end of the rotation. What I mean by the rotation is, you know, are you going to harvest these trees in 80 years? So it's an 80-year rotation from planting till the time you're going to harvest the trees. So the question is, if we are going to come in and do thinnings throughout, and one of the things you'll notice here is because you see all this vegetation on the ground here, because every third row of trees was taken out about 8 years ago, okay? This was much denser, and we took out about 1/3 of the trees a couple years ago. And the reason we did that is because these trees were growing up, and as they grow up, what happens through competition is as the tree gets taller and they're fighting for resources, the crowns of the trees start shrinking. And the overall height of the tree compared to the height of the crown gets larger. So they get taller, but the crowns get smaller. Hope I said that right. So what we do as pine plantation managers is we look and we wait until the crowns of the trees are about 25 to 30% of the height. And at that time, we realized the competition has got to the point where the growth is going to start slowing down. And so we come in and we do a thinning. And in this situation, we took out every third row so that the 2 rows that are left get light from the sides. And then they start growing again, and the crowns start expanding and they start growing, and the trees start getting bigger in girth. And the girth is what we're really interested in. So maybe 10, 15 years from now, 10 to 20 years from now, we might come back through and do another thinning where we come and take out every other row of trees. You know, that hasn't been decided yet, but we come through and we take out another set of rows of trees, and we might be left with 25% of the trees at the final harvest, 25% of the trees we planted. And everybody says, well, why don't you just plant 25% less trees and let them grow up? And, you know, what most people figure is mortality, that we're making up for mortality. It's not really a mortality thing, it's actually a wood quality issue. So if you've ever noticed trees that grow in the forest, and we talked about this on one of our first rambles, if you notice trees that grow in the forest in a closed canopy, they typically lose their lower branches unless they're really shade tolerant. If you've ever noticed a tree out in the woods, you're walking in the woods, everything's great, you see, but you come across this big old oak that has big branches way lower than all the surrounding trees. We call that a wolf tree. Some of you might have seen that. And you think, wow, what's going on with that tree? That tree is probably a tree that was open grown in agricultural land. And so it was a tree that was left for shade. It was a tree that was left for beauty, for aesthetics. And so because it got light from all sides, it kept all of those lower branches. And then when that agricultural land was abandoned, a new forest grew up around it in a more typical state where it was closed canopy and it lost its branches. So we plant these white pine at a higher density than we need for wood quality. We plant them at a high density so that the lower branches get shaded out by the upper branches and they fall off, and what happens then is you get knot-free wood. So if the branches stayed on, and you can see these aren't great trees here, there's some issues with some of these trees, but the upper area where you have branches are going to be really knotty, and down here where the branches are off, you're going to get knots up to this point, right? You have an old branch right here, an old branch right here. You'll get knots to this point, but now as this tree grows and grows, any wood that's outside of these knots is going to be clear wood without knots, and you're going to get a higher value for it. So that's this idea of density controlling wood quality. You know, these trees, I don't know how many of you remember knotty pine. Watch The Graduate, maybe. Maybe The Graduate has a pool scene, or some of these old movies from the 60s and 70s where they're playing pool in a downstairs den with a little wet bar in the corner, and the wall panels are all knotty pine, right, with the knots. That was in vogue at one point, but it's not really in vogue right now. So these trees are being managed for timber, for white pine timber, and we have a few of these plantations on campus. We're not putting any more in. We're actually managing the ones we have. And one of the reasons we haven't converted them all back to hardwoods yet is because I use them for teaching. For any prospective students who are watching this, this is another one of my classrooms where I do teach plantation silviculture for folks who are going to be interested in that. Another thing about white pine is the Biltmore estate, which is close to us, has a lot of white pine that's planted out there, and they're starting to transition a lot of that white pine. And I'm going to talk about that when we walk down a little bit. But trying to transition some of that white pine back to what normally would be hardwoods, what would be natural. White pine is on sites that would naturally be regenerated to hardwoods. And that's because when the Biltmore estate was established, it was highly degraded. There was gullies, there was very little topsoil, it had been logged over. And so the early forester there planted a lot of white pine to rehabilitate the land. And now one of the things we say is, white pine has done its job, it's rehabilitated the land, let's start cutting that white pine and transitioning it back to the hardwood species that would typically be on those sites. So that's a little bit about white pine. Let's walk down a little bit and look at what's going on with this plantation. These trees here, we inherited these trees. They were planted by Mr. Fortune. There's a bunch of land up here that was called the Fortune property. But this tree, the only thing we know about these trees is they were genetically improved. What that meant 30, 40 years ago, who knows? But look at this. See this scar right here? This is a branch that twisted all the way around and comes out right here, which is very atypical for a white pine to do something like this. So we're not exactly sure what's going on with the genetic improvement on these species, but these white pines have been doing some funky things. Oh, here's another. While we're on berberine and hydrostine, this is one Pete might know from West. This is Oregon grape, or Mahonia. This is another species that, if you open it up, you can see how yellow it is in here. Again, this is another one that you can extract berberine and hydrostine from. Another antimicrobial, the most common species that we think of with this is golden seal. And this is actually a non-native species in this area. It was brought in as a horticultural species, so it's more common in the western U.S. So I want to stop here, and I'm hoping Pete can pan. Just have a look at the structure of the forest and see if you can notice a change in the structure. What I mean is how many stems, what kind of stems, how big they are. Hopefully you got a peek at what's going on. You notice the white pines are over here, and it's pure white pine, except for the ground growth. There's really only white pine growing over here. But if you look over here, hopefully you'll notice all of this nonsense going on. Right? All of these small stems out here, but you'll also notice the white pine. The white pine out here is still in rows, right? So what's going on here? So one of the things that was drilled into my head as a young forestry student was the idea that past land use management has more of an effect on what you're seeing now than current environmental conditions. Let me say that again. Past land use history has more of an effect on what you're seeing now, more of an influence on what you're seeing now than current environmental conditions. Because forests take so long to grow and it's such a long-term proposition, really what you're seeing when you walk into a forest is the results of past disturbance, past management. So if you have a piece of land that's plowed for agriculture, continually plowed for agriculture, and then you abandon it, it's going to come up to much different species composition than if you had land that was grazed but not plowed for many years, and then you abandoned that land and the forest came back. In the first example, in a plowed land, because you were plowing constantly, there wouldn't be any seeds in there, there wouldn't be any old roots in there, and so whatever was going to grow would probably come in from outside the site, and a lot of times that would be white pine if you were up north, Virginia pine here. Whereas if you just grazed, you'd still have seeds in the floor, you'd still have roots on the floor, and once you took the animals off, those species would come in. So understanding why you're seeing what you're seeing quite often goes back 100 years, go back 50 years. So what do you think's going on here? I gave you a hint. When you think about white pine, pure white pine, to this mixed white pine with all these hardwoods. So, and here is a clue. I don't know if you can see this. This scar right here. And boy, was I proud of myself on Stump the Professor when somebody sent in the old yellow-bellied sapsucker scars, and man, I nailed that one. So just a little of that going on. So what do you think this scar is? This scar right here. This is an old fence scar. So this is where a fence was wrapped around this tree and went up. It's right on this border, this transition zone between pure white pine and this mixed white pine with the hardwood. So what happened is Mr. Fortune, when he was managing this property, and you can see some stumps right here where you don't see stumps out there. This was land over here that was agricultural land. You can still see some rows in here, some furrow rows in here. This was agricultural land. There was a fence here separating that agricultural land from this mixed hardwood stand on this side. What he did was stop the agricultural practices over here, took down the fence, came to this side, cut the forest down and burned it, and then planted the white pine in rows from here about a quarter mile down. So these rows of pines go all the way down here. And so what happened was over here you're left with pure white pine because there was no seed bank, there was no root sprouts to start, no stump sprouts to start. And over here, because this was a hardwood forest that he just planted the trees into, all of these hardwoods sprouted back and started coming up. And that's why you have this mixed structure between here and here. Another thing you might be able to notice is the trees on this side, you know, and this would be one, the trees on this side are generally bigger than the trees over here. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that only X amount of sunlight is coming in, a certain amount of sunlight is coming in to grow and to help the trees grow. And over here it's all going to the white pines, but over here it's not only going to the white pines, it's also going to the hardwoods, so there's more competition. Now, one of the things that we're doing up here, and we can take a walk up. Let's take a little walk up. Here's a bunch of sourwood. We talked about sourwood. Anybody remember what this growth pattern is? See how this tree right here is totally flat on the top? It's called planar growth. Remember planar growth? This tree is coming out and putting out all its leaves like this so it can maximize its photosynthetic area and capture light. So I want to show you this tree here. Everybody see, can you see this line, this perfect cut right here and this perfect cut right here? One of the things we're doing up here is we are trying to transition this side of the plantation back to hardwoods, okay? We're not interested in the economic value of these trees here. We're interested in the wildlife value. And so, because there's some beautiful oaks that are starting to grow and come up into these pines, rather than clear out the hardwoods, what we're doing is identifying the hardwoods that we think are going to be great acorn producers or beech nut producers. There's some beech up here. And we're only removing the white pines that are right directly competing with those so that those oaks are able to grow up into the canopy. Here's a cherry that's growing up into the canopy here. And so little by little, we're going to make these holes bigger and bigger and bigger so the hardwoods get a chance to outcompete the pines. And within 30 to 40 years, we'll turn this side into back to a pure hardwood stand. Now, if you were to hire me to come onto your property and look at these stands and say, Dave, I want a management plan to get the most economic value out of this forest that I have, you should fire me if I give you the plan that we're enacting here. Because the plan we're enacting here is for biodiversity and for wildlife. If you are interested in the economic value for this stand, what you would do is pull out all of these hardwood stems, right? All these little hardwood stems that are in here to promote the growth of the pines. So it's what are your objectives? If your objectives are economic value, you're going to go one way. If your objectives are biodiversity or wildlife values, you're going to go the other way. This is a tree that we girdled. Sorry, I started pointing to this and then left. This is a tree that we girdled right here. So sometimes you want to make the holes open up slowly. You don't just want to cut big holes because then you get weedy species and invasive species in. So what we did with the students is we had the students take some trees and just girdle them to kill them standing so they don't let the light on the ground all at once. These also provide great wildlife habitat. Snags are really important for gleaning birds, brown creepers, woodpeckers that come in and eat the bugs that are decomposing the tree. Also, you know, this isn't a great example, but on bigger trees, sometimes the bark comes loose and you can get bats roosting in these cracks. So this is an example of girdling the trees, and what we did was take a chainsaw and cut all the way around in 2 places so it can't send sugars down or water up the stem, and so they died here. Oh, here's a great species. This is chestnut oak. This is another one of our oaks, a dry side oak. It's one that doesn't have the big lobes. It's got more like teeth here. And generally speaking, we say that it's wider about 2/3 of the way up. So this is chestnut oak. This is a white oak. And I'm going to leave you with this little piece of information. So we have white oaks and red oaks in this area. We have 5 red oaks and 3 whites. Whites are post oak, white oak, and chestnut oak. And then we have scarlet oak, black oak, shingle oak, where am I? Northern red oak and southern red oak are the major oaks that we have, white oaks and red oaks. White oaks have less tannins in their bark. Tannins are chemicals that are bitter tasting. And so white oaks, if you're ever managing and you're interested in wildlife and you have a choice between cutting a red oak or a white oak, you always want to leave the white oak because the acorns are more palatable for wildlife. Flour would always be made out of white oak acorns, chestnut oak, post oak, or white oak. And evolutionarily, it makes kind of sense. A white oak acorn is on the tree for 1 year, and then it falls off. A red oak acorn is on the tree for 2 years. So it makes sense evolutionarily that the red oak would have higher tannins to make the nuts bitter, because those nuts are on the dinner plate for the squirrels and everything else for 2 years, where the white oak is only out there for 1 year. So that's white pine management, white pine plantation. Hopefully you've enjoyed this, you found it interesting. I don't know where we're gonna go next time, but pretty soon we'll get out again. Once the wildflowers are up, maybe we'll do a straight up wildflower hike. So take care, everybody have fun, stay safe, and I can't wait to get you out in the woods again.